But what a week it's been for yet another series of Australian natural disasters, this time floods. It began in Brisbane, and the gravity of that city's disastrous 2011 floods came awfully close to being replicated. Of course, for those there who've lost everything, records and comparisons are meaningless. Now, of course, that they're forced to start all over again. And we've all seen the devastation in northern New South Wales. Lismore and parts of Ballina are still underwater. And less than a year since last year's flood crisis in the Hawkesbury-Nepean area in Sydney, the people there have faced an almost identical washout. And our thoughts and prayers, of course, are with those who've actually lost loved ones. It may end up being as many as 10 lives lost to floods this time, because only 10 minutes ago, police confirmed a fifth body in the northern New South Wales area of Lismore. Well, now we've got the climate change warriors using these disasters to blame a warming planet and CO2 emissions. Horrible timing. And yet the greenest of scientists maintain you simply cannot link climate change to individual disasters. Now, the current La Niña pattern is the primary driver. We know that. Extended wet weather, more intense precipitation, and of course we don't have the dams to cope. The dams have not kept pace with population or development. Which brings me to another contributing factor, the increase in Australians electing to reside in dangerous floodplains. It is a fact. Just like we have increasing numbers of homes being built in bushfire-prone areas as well. That is a fact. Today, the National Disaster Relief boss, Shane Stone, he was quoted in 9 newspapers touching on this very sensitive point. He was quoted as saying, "You've got people who want to live among the gum trees. What do you think is going to happen? Their house falls into the river and they say it's the government's fault." Now, Shane Stone is renowned for his straight talking, but with homes still underwater, we're still finding bodies, and the flippancy of those words, it did not go down well at all. Labor Senator Murray Watt called for him to resign, and media commentators were almost as harsh. It is too early to blame anyone. And it could have been dealt with a lot more sensitivity, but that is Shane Stone. That's the way he operates. Although today on Sky News, he surprisingly didn't want a bar of expanding on his comments, diverting attention to the government's relief funding.
It is a conversation you've started by saying we need to rethink building on these floodplains, though.
Well, Tom, I'm not going to get into that right now. I've started the conversation, as I said. I was keen for it to start.
Now, he diverted from addressing the Gumtree comment 3 times during that interview until my colleague Tom Connell asked this.
Was the gum trees line a bit flippant?
Oh, nothing flippant about it at all. I mean, we've got people in the bushfire zone who are wanting to go back and build exactly where they were before. I mean, seriously.
Okay.
If we're going to tell it like it is, he is absolutely right. In recent decades, local and state governments have allowed far too much residential development in flood and also bushfire-prone precincts. In fact, entire Australian towns face regular critical flooding because they've been built and continue to be built on floodplains. Now, today, climate scientist and IPCC Vice Chair Professor Mark Howard, he was not so shy about picking up on Shane Stone's comments. In fact, he was arguing today for entire towns in this country to be shifted in future.
I wouldn't be building in the Hawkesbury-Nepean floodplain west of Sydney. Similarly around Brisbane, but there's many different towns and cities in Australia which have river frontage, which are susceptible. And I should say that that's happened in other parts of the world and very successfully. Right. So they've taken out houses and infrastructure from floodplains. That not only reduces the damage, it slows down the water, increases the water infiltration, so you reduce the flood.
Because where the houses were, you can have more areas that can take water.
Exactly. Look, I think it'd be a really significant effort, but we've done this before in Australia. So, for example, you look at Gundagai back in the 1800s, reasonably big town at the time, massive flood, caused massive damage and loss of life, and they shifted it uphill. And so we've actually done this before. We know pretty much how to do it.
I guess the scale is the big
scale and the politics of it.
Now, this fellow makes a couple of great points. Yes, in 1852, a flood from the Murrumbidgee River swept the first colonial town of Gundagai away, and the records say that it killed at least 78 people. 78 from a town of just 250, mind you. The town was literally resettled to a higher location to the south of the Murrumbidgee River, which is where it is today. Could we do that today? Maybe for small populations. But the expense to shift towns like Lismore or Grantham in Queensland would be unthinkable to the current crop of politicians. It wouldn't happen, which is why new building codes need to be drafted to prevent further development in dangerous rural and even urban areas. We always talk about this after a flood, but nothing seems to be done. This is what resilience commissioners need to be moving on. That sounds like one of their jobs, like the likes of Shane Stone and his New South Wales counterpart, Shane Fitzsimmons. They need to make this a priority. Don't just forget about the flood, do the recovery and move on, wait for the next one. No. Start moving some small populations and start making sure that local councils follow a new mandate about making sure they don't add on to the danger. Now, while the New South Wales government, we know what they should do. They need to push the greenies out of the way and raise the walls of Warragamba Dam. The need to prevent homes and futures being lost far outweighs putting a small section of bushland potentially underwater, seriously. And Queensland needs to stop this procrastination and assist the Wivenhoe Dam in catching and storing rainfall when excessive weather strikes, and that means building another dam. Bite the bullet and build another dam. Because forget about talking about climate change creating more disasters. Whether that's the case or not, we're increasing our population, and sadly we're increasing our population in areas that require water and in some places are in dangerous situations. We can prevent some of this by assisting in the building of dams and start changing some of these codes. We just need leaders with backbone who are not afraid of telling Greenies groups to just get out of the way.